Everyone loves the draft. Everyone loves the combine. One of the things that we like to talk about with the draft is one of the specific combine drills, the 40-yard dash. But the question is, does it actually matter, or is it just something that is fun to talk about? I mean, the reality is there aren't very many times in football where you're just running 40 yards down the field. In fact, fun fact, the reason why it exists is because that's what they were using to time gunners. Because, when it's a punt, that's kind of about how far a punt typically goes, is 40 yards. So it was a way to see who could be a better gunner, and it's morphed into something we use for every single position. But does it matter? Is there value in a 40-yard dash at specific positions? And the answer is, in some positions, it matters a ton. So starting off with this chart, first I have to explain what exactly you're looking at, and how I got this data. This is actually compiled of 3 different videos I've made since doing this channel. One about cornerbacks, one about safeties, and one about wide receivers. Those are the 3 positions we're going to talk about in this video. So all the charts are going to look a little different, and some might even have a different way of going about them. So I'll explain each one. But this is the cornerback chart, and what it is showing is that on a scale of 1, 2, 3, I just looked at every single corner that was drafted in the first round of the past several years and said, okay, 3 being the best, 1 being the worst, where do you rank? And graded them accordingly. Then I looked at what was their 40 time and put them in that category. And what I saw was that guys who ran a sub 4.4 were almost always great. Like, they were really consistently really good. I mean, there was very few misses. There actually wasn't a single just straight up miss that ran a sub 4.4 that was drafted in the first round. The guys who ran 4.4 but were able to break 4.5, those guys still did good, but there was a drop off. And the guys who could not break 4.5, there was a much bigger drop off. So for corners, 40 time is something I absolutely pay attention to. I think it matters a lot. And something I was thinking about that makes sense to me is, well, in today's NFL, you pretty much just get out of position. That's just something that happens, is you're constantly getting out of position. And so instead of trying to find the corners that get out of position the least, how about finding the corners who, when they get out of position, they're able to come back and still make a play? And I think that's why you see so many of the elite corners in the NFL are also very quick, or at least a lot of them are. And the fast guys, at least, don't seem to bust too often. The fast guys, at the very least, seem to still be solid contributors. So for the cornerback position, I would say yes, that matters. Now, of course, there's going to be exceptions. People will bring up, like, James Bradbury, not the fastest corner. He still has success. Xavier Howard, not the fastest corner. There's exceptions, right? So I don't necessarily think that I would sit here and say that, like, if there's a slow corner, never draft them or anything like that, because of course there's exceptions, but you're going to find exceptions to every rule, and I think it's a danger to try and chase outliers. That's how I view it. So I'll be very wary of drafting a corner who cannot break 4.5. Moving on to safeties. Safeties now, it's the same thing of, where they ranked in terms of their 40 time and then their score on a scale of 1 to 3. Chart looks a little different, but it's the same general concept, where the safeties who ran 4.6s had a score of 2. The safeties who ran 4.5, they had a score of 2.83. Also 28-3. There's a Patriots Falcons reference there if you want it. And then the corners who ran, keep saying corners. The safeties who ran a 4.45 to 4.5 ended up with a 2.3. And then if they couldn't break 4.5, if they did below 4.5, then they they scored a 1.88. So amazingly, the fastest safeties ended up performing the worst in this scenario, which seems very surprising, but actually could make some sense. It's possible that the fast safeties kind of get overdrafted simply due to their speed, even if they're not actually great players. And the safety position is so mental, it's so intelligence-based, that potentially just having speed actually doesn't really help you as much as the NFL feels it does, and probably is an overvalued stat. However, is there still some value in getting guys who are faster? Potentially, right? Because I know you could look at it and say, okay, the worst situation is the fastest players. Well, then who cares about speed? Well, you still have a scenario where the players who were able to break 4.6 perform better than players who did not break 4.6. I do think it's possible to say that speed is something that is overvalued by the NFL and causes guys to get drafted in the first round that probably shouldn't be drafted in the first round, but there might actually still be some importance to it, but I wouldn't put a ton of importance on it. For corners, I think there's a clear correlation that 40 time matters, and you should pay attention to that stuff. For safeties, there just isn't a clear correlation for me. So it's a trait that I think you can pay attention to, but I don't think you should pay a ton of attention to it. Of course, if someone's an outlier, if someone's a safety you like and they ran a 4.3, then I think that you should like them more. That makes sense. And if someone's a safety that you're okay about, but they run a 4.7, then maybe that should concern you a little more. I think those are reasonable. But as a whole, when we're getting into the 0.5 of a second, or 0.05 of a second, I should say, differences with some of these guys, I wouldn't care that much about it. Finally, wide receivers, which is the smallest sample size I made on this list. I also did it a little bit differently. For whatever reason, I decided to mix it up when I made my wide receivers video about this, and just decided, are you good or are you bad? That was simply the criteria I used. So it wasn't it wasn't a statistic based on 1 through 3. It was actually just good or bad. What are the odds of you being good or bad? So let's see what happened. Well, the wide receivers who ran a 4.3 or better, they ended up being good about a third of the time. However, if you ran a 4.4, you were good about 2/3 of the time. And again, we are dealing with small sample sizes here, worth mentioning. 4.5 was still over 50% of the time, but out of the 3 examples of guys who ran 4.6, those were not good. Although I should say that since then, we've seen someone like Drake London, who, while didn't run a 40 time, I would assume would be into 4.6s. He ended up being successful, so it's obviously not 0%. But what's interesting here is that you could argue there is a correlation once again. You could argue that it is beneficial to be fast. The issue is that the really fast guys get overdrafted, like a John Ross, for example. So just because someone runs a 4.2 doesn't mean they'll be successful, but similar to how I feel about safeties, but just a little bit more so, that I think it's a trait you should pay attention to still. I do think it's a trait that matters. I just think the NFL probably overvalues the high-end speed, but at the end of the day, obviously, being faster is going to help you. I mean, that goes without saying that if you have speed at the wide receiver position, then of course that's going to help. So what's our takeaway from all of this? What have we learned here with this? Well, I think we've learned that cornerback position, for the cornerback position, the 40 time just matters. It matters a ton. I'm not saying you can't draft a corner who didn't run a 4.3, but I am saying that if you're kind of in between a couple of corners, maybe even if you have a slight liking towards one corner over a different corner, if there's one of them that ran a faster 40 time, I think that's a totally valid reason to draft them. I think that, again, if there's a correlation and if there's evidence to show that something matters, I think you'd be foolish to look away from it. I think that clearly there's some evidence there to show that it matters. Although, again, maybe a bigger sample size, you could find out that, you could find more out about it. The safeties, again, I probably just wouldn't pay that much attention to 40 time at all. I'd pay attention to game speed, how I feel about their speed, just watching the tape, more so than 40 time, and maybe just use 40 time as a tool to figure out what their game speed is, but it's not something I would put a ton of value onto, and I don't put a ton of value onto the speed for safeties when I evaluate them. For wide receivers, again, it's a trait. It's something you should pay attention to. It's like height, right? Where it's like you can't just draft a tall receiver because they're tall, but if they are tall, then yeah, sure, pay attention to that. Every year when you see those, biggest bust of the year at the wide receiver position, they are a lot of times fast guys. They are, because a lot of times fast guys do get overdrafted. At the same time, a lot of times the best receivers of the year are also fast guys, right? So definitely don't feel afraid to like someone because of their speed. Just make sure you're not liking them just because of their speed. Make sure that there's other traits out there if you're an NFL GM watching this, because otherwise you could be drafting a player who might not be very good. But yeah, those are my thoughts on all of this. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.